Hey guys, it's Pineapple and we're back for chapter 408 for My Hero Academia spoilers. This chapter is titled Eyes Full of Determination, and I know I missed you guys last week for the spoilers, but I did do a full chapter review to kind of make up for it. So if you didn't see that, make sure you go and check it out because I know it comes out on a different day than you're used to. But let's get right into this chapter. All for One's flashback. The chapter starts with us seeing All for One with a rather blank and emotionless expression as he holds his hand forward, and suddenly in front of him is his younger brother Yoichi, who last chapter began to run away alongside the second One for All user Kudo and the First Quirk User, whose name we'll actually get a little bit later in this chapter. All for One stares forward and thinks to himself that if his brother can't stay with him, then he can't stay with anyone. As you see All for One using the same quirk that he tried to use on Hawks back during the Gunga Mountain battlefield, when Cammy came in and saved Hawks by using her illusions. It seems like the quirk somehow blows someone apart in a strange spiral-like motion, and All for One watches as his brother's body drops into the water of the sewer in front of him, as for a second he looks stunned when his brother's blood splatters onto his face. Here we get narration from All for One explaining Yoichi's name, and in the last video we explained how we thought that All for One was probably the one to name Yoichi, with his name having the characters for First and Give included within it, because All for One feels like his little brother was the first thing he was given in his entire life. From here we see the resistance fighters that were led by Kudo, the second One for All user, as they continue to run away, turning back to yell at their leader to stand up after he falls to the ground and stays there shocked for a moment after Yoichi's slaying. The third user, a man named Bruce, which is likely a reference to Bruce Lee, since fundamentally the Fajin technique was actually used by Bruce Lee in real life, despite it not giving him giant red rings that boost his every movement. However, Bruce tries to stand Kudo up as All for One menacingly walks towards them in the sewers, but it's to no avail as the gear shift user has locked eyes of All for One as Yoichi's blood is splattered onto his face as well, and the panel zooms into the eyes of evil and good as we see tears and rage starting to well up in Kudo's eyes as All for One's eyes have become empty white voids, reminding us that something is entirely unhuman about this guy. Time passes as we see All for One in the prime of his adult life, likely somewhere in his 30s, as by this point the chaos in society has begun to quell down, because in the timeline this is roughly around the time where All for One has started to rule as the Dark King from the shadows. But alone in his penthouse apartment in the tallest building in the city, All for One holds onto his brother's severed hand and thinks to himself. Using his quirk to scan Yoichi's hand, he figures out that Yoichi's quirk is somehow no longer in his body and sits there mystified, trying to figure out how exactly this had happened, since it's something that he's never experienced before, as elsewhere we pick up with the second and third users of One for All. We see as Bruce does some research on Kudo's body to try and figure out how he's changed after the gear shift user said that he felt weird, thinking that maybe All for One touched him at some point and planted a quirk on his body that may lead him directly to them, or any number of other possibilities. When Kudo asks him to just come out with the test results, Bruce reveals that Kudo's body is currently holding two quirk factors inside of it, but one of them is incredibly weak. It's almost like it isn't even there, and we know thanks to having read the entire MHA story that this would have been the One for All quirk and the tiny bit of energy that Yoichi was able to muster over his life. Here we see Kudo as he looks at his hand and starts to picture Yoichi, as All for One elsewhere holds onto Yoichi's severed hand and starts to do the same thing, as we see four split panels that show two different versions of Yoichi, one in the way that All for One sees him, which features Yoichi in a black ragged t-shirt, while the other is the white long sleeve that we actually did see him wear. At this point, Kudo realizes that Yoichi's will lives on from inside of him, while All for One realizes that Yoichi's quirk and the associated soul that he can interact with that goes with it are absolutely somewhere, since quirks are never destroyed. So he realizes that the quirk and his information must have been passed on to someone else. From here, we see this vision of Yoichi that Kudo is having, saying it's a shame that his brother didn't care more about people, because his quirk could have been an amazing one to bring about cooperation and good things for humanity if he wanted it to be. But instead, we see the path that All for One did take in a double-page spread where he starts his path to retrieving his brother at any cost. First taking down Kudo like we saw in the flashback before, but then hunting down the third quirk user, thinking, okay, maybe this time I've got them cornered, but no dice. Not knowing where else to turn, All for One forms his own cult, and we see that in one of the first meetings, the doctor is actually there looking much younger than he's ever looked before, and this period of time is likely because the fourth user actually went missing, like he was hiding in the forest, making the power stronger until he almost died of old age. So there was actually no One for All user for All for One to hunt down, because that guy was out somewhere in the mountains. However, after meeting the doctor, somehow All for One is able to get back on One for All's trail as he captures the Black Whip user Daigoro Banjo, finally sensing One for All inside of the man in front of him. But as All for One tries to steal the quirk, his hand gets pushed back as he's completely rejected and looks shocked, as in his head he pictures his brother's arm pushing his own arm away, because he can't have everything for himself any longer. After Banjo gets away and manages to give the quirk to the Smoke Quirk user N, we see that N gets gojoed by All for One, but still has enough life in him to die with a smile on his Nana's face as he rips a clump of hair out that gets passed on to Nana, who takes it to a cloud of smoke and keeps it safe until she's able to take the quirk for herself. We know how things went with Nana as she eventually faces off with All for One on a barge in the middle of the water in Japan, but by this point she already gave the quirk over to All Might, leading us to a page that actually shows us a moment from the original All Might versus All for One fight, where we see with a full powered punch, All Might punches All for One's head clean off, blowing it away into a smear of blood, which should have been the end of him. However, the doctor managed to steal his body from the morgue, saving All for One's life using banned medical practices, as All for One comes back to life, breaking out of the private hospital facility he was stored in and screaming out into the streets, as All for One's backstory ends and we finally make it back to the current day and Bakugo and the Prince of Darkness face off. Bakugo versus All for One. All for One stares into Bakugo's eyes and he realizes why he reminds him of the second user of One for All so much, and it isn't because those two are related, because apparently All for One killed any and everyone who was ever close to the second user so that his bloodline wouldn't continue on. But almost like all masters of the craft will reach the same place, years later he's face to face with Bakugo, who still somehow has those same exact eyes, those eyes of determination to defeat All for One that so few people he ever came across truly had. Here All for One thinks about how he's wasted so much time already and how enough is enough. Now is the moment to end this because he still has to have enough energy left to deal with Shigaraki. So All for One places everything on one final bet and uses every single quirk he's ever taken all together, becoming a giant disgusting monster that has the faces and heads of all the people whose quirks he stole, as All for One pretty much turns himself into a giant moving ball of destruction that starts ripping through the entire town as it makes its way towards Bakugo, with All Might and Edgeshot saying after this attack, All for One will likely become a baby, which really confuses me because All for One just said he needed to keep enough energy in the tank to fight Shigaraki after this, but maybe as always, All Might just has no idea what the fuck he's talking about. On the final page of the chapter, we see as Bakugo stares down the massive mountain of destruction heading his way, as it looks like All for One has an entire sun behind him, with him in the center like a pupil of a massive eye, as everything in this moment rides on Bakugo because Deku is too busy fighting Shigaraki with the strongest off-screen technique I've ever seen in manga. Bakugo puts his hands up and stares All for One down, saying, "Are you stupid? There's no way this dumb thing is gonna win," as we really do head towards the very end of our story at a pace that personally I'm not a big fan of, but we've gone too far to go back now. So that's a chapter of My Hero Academia, and maybe we'll be back Sunday for a full review, but in the meantime, check out any of my other content from my Invincible shorts to my gameplay I've been uploading and even more. Also, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at Vocal Pineapple, so hopefully I'll see you there, and peace.